You all. So in this video today we're going to be going through the remaining two stories of our four that are treating the photographic process. And well, aside from the little quiz that I'm giving you on these stories, this is in preparation for the final exam. So if I can call it an exam. So just like the midterm, you're going to be asked to write two sort of 1,000 word essays, one of which will be on the novel Everything is Illuminated, which is going to be in the next 3 videos. And the other short essay is going to be on these short stories. So, like the previous two that we've looked at, Viewfinder and The Adventures of a Photographer, these two that we're coming to today explore the limits of photography. I mean, to an extent, all of these stories touch on its beauty and its power and how empowering it can be. But I think increasingly, as we go through them, we can see them as exploring the limitations of photography. This first story today, The Day of the Dying Rabbit, is a clever story, I think. It's giving us a narrator who shuttles across the different subject identities that are intrinsic to the photographic process, as we've been discussing. So we have a guy in this case who is operator photographer, who is target, and who is also spectator. And he sort of shuttles between these positions. And this particular story is clever also, I think, in its multiple framing, so that the story itself actually metaphorically can be seen as a lens. That will be clearer, much clearer at the end of the story. And also, it is a story that introduces us to ekphrasis. This is, well, it's a rhetorical term. It captures the idea of one artistic medium being used to describe what's going on in another, to capture its essence, if you like. A good example would be something you're familiar with, so the graphic novel, okay? So that's any illustration which is matched with literary text is an example of ekphrasis. The illustration is designed to capture, if you like, the essence of what's being described on the page in text. So, turning to this story, in fact, why don't I bring it up? We find, as with all good stories, so much happening in the first few lines, paragraph or two. Almost everything is revealed to us there, or foreshadows what's going to come. The shutter clicks, and what is captured is mostly accident, says the narrator. But let's notice that we have a first-person narration here. I keep telling you that's one of the first questions you need to be asking yourself as a literature student. And why? Why do we have first person? Well, generally speaking, first person omniscient in this case is very effective at creating immediacy, but it also it entraps the reader. We're inside the narrator's head, their mind space, there's kind of no way out of that. And it also, of course, enables us to question judgment. And I think that in this particular case, it's a very interesting choice of narration, because the narrator here, as we discover, is a photographer himself, right? But the first-person narration gives us the sense, metaphorically, of him taking shots, describing everybody he sees and everything that happens as if taking a photograph. So I think it's kind of an interesting and clever use of point of view. All right, so everything, or a lot, I should say, a lot of what is captured is accident, he says. The telling expression forever pinned in mid-flight between two plateaus of vacuity, of emptiness. Margaret and I didn't exactly intend to have 6 children. So now the notion of accident is transposed into his very family. And we have description. So we can see that he engages with the world as operator, as photographer. Children are delicate as film. He's using simile here, metaphor, wrapped in bunting instead of lead foil, but coiled with that same miraculous brimming, whatever it is, susceptibility. Why is that in italics? So we've got a wobbly hot head, navy blue eyes set with the pupils at f2, which is an aperture setting. So we have some technical jargon here, which is photography jargon. And then he tells us, I'm a photographer by trade, and one trick of the trade is a lot of takes. In fact, all 6 kids have turned out pretty well now that we've got the baby's feet to stop looking at each other and Deirdre fitted out with glasses. There are so many lenses operating in this story. Here's another. So we rent the same 4-room shack every August, and when the cat dragged in as a love present this mauled rabbit it had caught, it was minutes before I could get close enough to even to see. And again, we should see. That is in italics. Why? And generally speaking, italics are used in text for emphasis. But here, I think it's basically, it's text as focus. So metaphorically speaking, we are encouraged to focus because of the italics. But I think that what this also establishes for us, this second paragraph, the end of it, is that that's what matters to this guy. It's what he can see. This is how he interacts with the world. Okay, now the other thing, which in a way has been set up by the previous story we've looked at, we've got this nice metaphoric link between the photographic process of reproduction of images and the human reproduction of babies. So, the qualities of camera and of film are being superimposed onto baby form, and the baby form or the child form is significant because of how it can be the subject or target of a photograph. So that's the setup here, and our introduction to this guy, this narrator. All right, so even sound here is interpreted by him as sight. Henrietta screamed. There are screams like flashbulbs. Just that cold. Now, we've got an interesting description of the corridor. It isn't wide enough for 2 pairs of shoulders, and off the corridor into the outdoors is a salt-pimpled aluminium screen door with a misadjusted pneumatic attachment that snaps like lightning the first 2/3 of its arc and then closes the last third, slow as a clock, ticking. What does that suggest to you? Of course, a box camera lens, a single lens reflex camera, the aperture closing, snapping. And it's in that context of, if you like, the camera obscura, the box, the SLR, whatever you want to call it, that the rabbit is revealed to us. And elsewhere, the children. So we have Deirdre, Margaret, Linda. And we have another sort of theme being introduced to at the end of this first page, which goes to the sort of uncontrollable nature of the subject or target. So the more pop out the words, in other words, the more angelic her face grows. She's 13, and in a few years, I suppose, it will be liquor and drugs going in. I don't know where she gets the words or how to stop them coming. Her cheeks are trimming down, nose bows edging up, so he's got a very kind of visual impression of her. I don't know how to stop that coming either. Faces, when you look at them through a lens, are passageways for angels, sometimes whole clouds of them. I told him that a dozen angels overlapped in his face as he mentally matched up casket with fatness and piano and earth and got the picture. Click. And so we have these sort of sentence fragments which are like sort of the taking of a snapshot here. But in this paragraph, we're beginning to get this idea that, well, it's captured in the first sentence. There's a lot that's accidental, that he can't control, that he can't fix. It goes to his photographs and it goes to his children. It goes to his life in general. So now, next paragraph, there's the sound of a slap and a second silence while it developed. So we have these photographic processing images. And now we have the rabbit sort of revealed or exposed. No one dared touch it. We froze around in a circle. And then God came down the hall from the smaller children's room. And it's meant to be ironic and amusing. Godfrey is the slightly odd one out, as we discover. Some club feet, slow to walk, bit clumsy, bit gormless. That's the ironic humour, that God should be clumsy and gormless. But he's the one who's got the courage to pick up the rabbit, and he does, and then he just drops it, has another go to see if it's going to be alive. And then we have the reference to Jimmy, who is the sort of problem child or most significant other at the moment in the narrator's life. We needed Jimmy. He and Deirdre have the natural touch middle children tend to, but all month he's been out of the shack, out of our way, playing catch with himself, rowing in the pond, brooding on what it means to be a boy. He's 10, I've missed him. A father is like a dog. He needs a boy for a friend. So, the rabbit is somehow revived in God's hands, and we move on. The lens, because of course this is reference to the rabbit eye here, is isinglass, which is a kind of gelatine used as a clarifying agent. Jimmy comes in from the pond. There's fussing and crying. The rabbit's lying panting on its right side, the bad eye up. Jimmy's nostrils pinched in, and he turned his back on the whole business. He had got the picture. The rabbit was going to die. And at the back of my brain, I felt tired, damp, and cold. And what was it in the next 24 hours that slowly flooded me, that makes me want to get the day on some kind of film? I don't know exactly, so I must put everything in, however underexposed. And so ends the sort of first part of this story. And we have a story about seeing as a process. It's a story about what happens to us when we see things, and how so often that is an accidental and uncontrollable process, beyond expectation and beyond desire. And the photograph in this story is a metaphor for that. It's a metaphor for that process, and it's set up by the first sentence, as if Edgar Allan Poe were writing this story. But also, at the end of this first section here, we have a very deliberate reference to ekphrasis, what I was referring to earlier, because basically what he's saying is he understands, the narrator understands, that in order to make sense of what he is seeing, he's going to have to put it into words. He's going to have to use language. Okay, so we move into the next part of the story. We're introduced to a couple, the Pingrees. There's Ian and there's Jenny. And what we have next reveals to us, I think, the rather perhaps disturbing voyeuristic character of the narrator. One wonders whether Updike is actually suggesting that you, in a sense, have to be voyeuristic and detached if you are going to be a professional photographer. I don't know, but that seems to be at least what is being said about this narrator. He describes her in a very kind of objective way, the freckles, the hips, da da da. I could look at her forever, he says. She's such fun for the eyes, which isn't the same as being photogenic. The few shots I've taken of her show a staring woman with baby fat, whereas some skinny snit who isn't even a name to me comes over in the magazines as my personal vision of Eros. So the camera does lie all the time. It has to. In other words, Jenny, for the narrator, is more than he can ever capture in her photograph. And I think that's an important point being made here. Also, that the process itself changes the target in a way that distorts, he's suggesting here. So, back to the wife, Margaret, the rabbit, which is now in a shoebox under a protective lean-to of cookout grills. Photographed by sulfur glow, undertakers at work. But, okay, it's not hopping, but the whiskers are moving. It's still alive, at least. And top of the next page, we have a nighttime scene, some lovemaking between husband and wife, and it's revealed to us here that this is a marriage which is stale. It's darkness, but there's moonlight. Great eye sockets beneath me looking up. This idea of gaze, gazing on gazing back. Margaret slipped into sleep quick as fish afterward, but for an uncertain length of time, I lay there, the rabbit swollen, huge and oppressive, blanketing all of us, a clenching of the nerves, snatching me back from sleep by a whisker. The breathing and rustling all around me precarious, the rumbling and swaying of a ship that at any moment, the next or then the next, might hit an iceberg. And so he's acutely aware in these morning hours, early morning hours, of the precariousness of life, of mortality. It's as though the rabbit has triggered in him a sense of mortality, of his own mortality. New snapshot, sentence fragment, morning. Okay, then we move on. The rabbit took some milk and his isinglass eyes slightly widened as though the lens is being activated here. A lot of technical language here about how he's going to take photographs using particular rolls of film. And then we have an encounter with his son, which is very upsetting to him because he slaps him. I didn't mean to grab him so hard. The marks on my hand were still red on his arm half an hour later. So, you know, this is a narrator who's slightly out of control of his emotions, unable to control his emotions, I should say, and unsettled, distressed, upset. It's suggestive of some kind of midlife crisis, isn't it, I think? And perhaps reflecting that, the rabbit's eye now starts to look cloudier, top of the next page. And the arc of the whisker tips even more fractional. Okay, next snapshot, lunch. Soup and sandwiches. And we have the tennis match here being described. Interesting, 2/3 of the way down, I think. So the Pingarees dropped me off at our mailbox. There was going to be a beach picnic. The mail consisted of forwarded bills, pencil-printed letters to the children, and Life, this magazine. And while walking down our dirt road, I flicked through an over-gorgeous photographic essay on Afghanistan. Hurrying blurred women in peacock-coloured saris, mud palaces, rose dust, silver rivers high in the Hindu Kush, an entire valley, misted, forested earth, filled the centre page spread. The lenses those people have. Nothing beautiful on earth is as selfless as a beautiful lens. You know, it's what I was saying earlier. This is what the story is about. It's about the lenses that we use on other people and the lenses that they use on us. And I think what he's saying here is that the lens can be beautiful. Beautiful in the way that it can establish communication, and in the way that it can reveal and display things. And aesthetically, it can be beautiful, but it also distorts. And it can objectify and be damaging and hurtful. I think the bunnies had it. I said, things don't look good in terms of the rabbit here. And then on the next page, we have the narrator back to being the photographer again, to setting everything up and seeing everything as if it's in pose. Yeah, there's a sense of staging here. So about a third of the way down, I took the rabbit out beyond the prickly yard into the field, laid it beneath the least stunted swamp oak. I put a marsh marigold by its nose, with a self-congratulatory sensation that must have carried on my face back to the shack, for Margaret in the kitchen, loading the refrigerator, looked up at me and said, I don't mind you being partners with Jenny, but you don't have to toss balls to her in that cute, confiding way. In this, on this page towards the end, he once again is kind of thrown by the reaction of his kids. He's expecting this to be a sort of Greek tragedy with everybody wailing and screaming and crying about the dead rabbit. In fact, the kids just move on really quickly. Mummy, can I make the cocoa? It's only really Jimmy who it seems to react. Yeah, he was the only one who cried. He came home a half hour after we'd meant to set out rowing across the pond. And he lashes out. Interesting moment halfway down. Margaret says, somehow you've deliberately dramatized this. As though he made this composition as a photographer. As we go through this beach scene, page 220, 221, we again see the voyeuristic nature of the narrator here. But Updike seems to be saying to us that, well, actually, it's this which enables him to see through the masks of these two people in particular, Jenny and Ian. That's his talent, but at the same time makes him voyeuristic. And voyeuristic in the sense that he eavesdrops on conversations, the things that the kids are saying. Halfway down 221, we have a description of the scene, very described as a photographer would describe it. And yeah, we have this idea of someone detached and just voyeuristically just taking in the scene here. Across the fire, I watched his wife, spurned by me, already gesturing with the teenage boy who was not her son, and wondered how I would take that picture, because that's what matters to him. Tri-X wide open at 1/60th, but the shadows would be lost. This guy is murmuring on about his money, whatever. Exposures flickered in and out around the fire, glances, inklings, angels. We keep having these references to something spiritual and godlike, which I think really comes to the fore at the end of the story. We have a halo here. Excuse me, it's a halo of hair around the knees. Innocent as babies' pates. And all the time, it's like he's got to find these metaphors and similes to describe what he's seeing. And then we come to this fabulous ending, I think. So the old man's face went silent and suffered a deflation wherein nothing held firm but the reflected glitter of firelight. On a tooth his grimace had absent-mindedly left exposed. It's very cutting, isn't it? It's very... I mean, there's no sentiment here. Beyond him, on the edge of the light, Cora and Linda were revealed sitting together, their legs stretched out long before them, warming, their faces in shadow, sexless and solemn. Godfrey was asleep, his head pillowed on Margaret's thigh, his body suddenly wrenched by a dream sob and a heavy succeeding sigh. It was strange, after these fragmentary illuminations, to stumble through the unseen sand and grass with our blankets and belongings to the boats on the shore of the pond. Margaret and 5 children took the rowboat. I nominated Jimmy to come with me in the kayak. The night was starless, so we've got this blackness now. The pond between the retreating campfire and the slowly nearing lights of our neighbours' houses was black. I could scarcely see his silhouette as it struggled for the rhythm of the stroke. Left, a little turn with the wrists. Right, the little turn reverse. Left, our paddles occasionally clashed or snagged on the weeds that clogged this pond, but the kayak sits lightly, and soon we put the confused conversation of the rowers and their wildly careening flashlight beam behind. Silence widened around us. Steering the rudder with the foot pedals, I let Jemmy paddle alone and stared upward until I produced in the haze sky overhead a single unsteady star. It winked out. That's it. That's the shot. That's the celestial, heavenly pinhole in the sky. And the narrator and his son have just been snapped on, if you like, the reflecting glass of the pond. It's the moment of exposure. And that's what I mean by when I said earlier that the narrator becomes target. At the very end of this story, it's as though a photograph has been taken of him and his son. And it establishes a new communion and bond between them. It's an epiphany and a celebratory moment. But I think there is a spiritual dimension to the story. The pond was more populous than China. So this is the animalcula hailing our passage with bright shouts. It's like the silver filings on a pewter plate that Nietzsche or Daguerre would have used here. The pond was more populous than China. My son and I were afloat on a firmament warmer than the heavens. Phosphorescence everywhere with every stroke. Hey, Dad, his voice broke the silence carefully. My benevolence engulfed him. My fellow wanderer, my leader, my gentle, secretive future. What, Jimmy? I think we're about to hit something. We stopped paddling and a mass grey etched on grey, higher than a man, glided swiftly towards us and struck the prow of the kayak. And with this bump and my awakening laugh, the day of the dying rabbit ended. Exulting in homogeneous glory, a glory that unites, I had steered us into the back. We pushed off, and by the lights of our neighbours' houses navigated to the dock and waited for the rowboat with its tangle of voices and impatience and things that would snag. And the days since have merely been happy days. This day was singular in its, let's say, in italics, snapshot, gallantry. Between the cat's gallant intentions and my son's gallantly calm warning, the dying rabbit sank like film in the development pan and preserved us all. The flash bulb at the end of this story is everything illuminated. I think that's what happens in a sort of divine, celestial, spectral shot. And I think it takes us to this idea that the photograph is never of the whole person. It's accidental, beautiful, illustrative, etc., but there's always something beyond. If this story is about us searching for the truth, then I think what the narrator understands is that the truth cannot be found solely on a visual plane. We've been here before, haven't we? That's exactly what Calvino is telling us, that we need language, we need words, we need that ekphrasis. But the difference, I think, between Calvino's story and this one is that in Calvino's story, the point of view traps Antonino. He's just, there's no way out. That's what's so awful and despairing about the story. It's like he's framed. Whereas in this story, and I think it's because of the first person narration, there is a sense that at the end of the story, the narrator has found something, a peacefulness, a recognition of the limitations of his art. And in the recognition that there's a more profound lens, which is story. What you could say is that we have a narrator who has shifted from being a photographer to being a writer. Okay, let's move to our final story. Shots. It's another brilliant story, I think. So I think the other three stories we've looked at have explored the limits of photography and the photographic process, either in the sort of psychotic behavior it can induce. Just think about Viewfinder, right? And Antonino. And in the kind of disturbingly voyeuristic characteristics of the narrator in The Day of the Dying Rabbit. So it's either problematic and limited in its behavioral characteristics that it can trigger, or the photographic process is limited insofar as it requires language to describe it. It requires ekphrasis. So I think that's what these three stories have been setting out for us. What Cynthia Ozick does in this story, I think, is start to explore the idea that there is a truth behind the image, behind the photographic image, which obtains in the ineffable, which is to say, beyond language. There's a truth in the process itself. It's kind of a hazy, difficult idea at the moment, but I think she's very clever in the way that she takes us there. We're back to first person again. For the same reason I think that Updike used first person. And we're back to Roland Barthes. Look at how this sets up. So I came to photography as I came to infatuation. This is a story about the photographic process and love. She has no special talent, she says. As for taking pictures, when I take them, it has nothing to do with art and less to do with reality. I'm blind to what intelligent people call composition. I reveal grain and drag through, I hate galleries. It's just a machine, right? For her. The rest is thingamajig. What brought me to my ingenious profession was no idea of the photograph as a successor to the painting, and no pleasure in darkrooms or in any accumulation of clanking detritus. Call it necrophilia. I have fallen in love with corpses. Now, you remember Roland Barthes and his idea that the eidos, or the essence of the photograph, is death. This is exactly what this narrator is about here. I have fallen in love with corpses, she says. Dead faces draw me. I'm uninformed about the history of photography, 1832, daguerreotype, mercury, whatever, except to understand how long a past the camera has, measured by a century-old length of a woman's skirt. People talk of inventing a time machine as if it hadn't already been invented in the box and shutter. I have been ravished by the last century's faces. Now motes in their graves, such lost eyes and noses and mouths and earlobes and dress collars. My own eyes soak these up. I can never leave off looking at anything brown and brittle and old and decaying at the edges. She comes across a photograph under some leaves in the corner of a yard behind the home for elderly female ill. It's no accident because the story is about mortality and decay. And the photograph is of a brown girl. Now, we don't know whether skin brown or sepia, but that's how she describes it. And next page, she says, the brown girl lived. She lay in a pile of albums dumped into the leaves. It seemed there were hundreds of her. A grave girl, a sepia girl, a girl as brown as the ground. She must have had her sorrows. And what we find in the next paragraph is that it strangely seems as though this photograph and what seem to be multiple photographs of her are all overexposed. So the face faded out. The woman turned to ghost. The fingers were ringless, the eyes whitened off. A vast, blurred, drowning orb of sun flooded massively, habitually down from the upper right corner of her picture. Whoever photographed over years and years meant to obliterate her. But I knew it was no sun bleach that conspired to efface her. What I was seeing, what I had seen, was time. And not time on the move either, the illusion of stories and movies. What I had seen was time as stasis, still captured. This is the punctum of time that Barthes talks about. Time at the standstill, time at the fix, the time of Keats's Grecian urn. The face faded out because death was coming. Death, the changer, the collapser, the witherer, death, the bleacher, the blancher, the whitener. So, the brown girl, top of the next page, I kept her. I mean, as a pocket of my mind, and one of her pictures in the pocket of my blouse. I kept her because she was dead. And what I expect you to take from this is that I could keep her even though she was dead. It's like that picture of the guy who is about to be executed in 1865. You remember? I think it's Lewis Hine. I showed you in a previous video. This man who is alive and yet about to be dead, and who is dead at the same time as we look at him. It's exactly that kind of conflation going on here. And it was she, the brown girl, who gave me the miraculous hint. I think this is a key moment in the story here, which takes us beyond the other three stories. A hint derived from no science of mechanics or physics, a rapturous hint on the other side of art, beyond metaphor, deep in the wonderfully literal. What she made me see was that if she wasn't a girl anymore, if she wasn't a woman anymore, if she was very likely not even a member of the elderly female ill anymore, by the time her photos fell among the leaves, how long had she been lying under them, still I had her. Actually and physically, and with the certainty of a simple truth, I could keep her, just as she used to be, because someone who'd once looked through the bunghole of a box and clicked off a lever. Whoever had desultorily drowned her in too much sun had anyhow given her a monument 2 inches wide, 3 inches long. And what happened then was here now. I had it in the pocket of my blouse. It's almost as though she's just captured time. But even though she's had this kind of epiphany and understood that there's a truth here that's been revealed to her, it doesn't make life any easier or any more fun. So we next have a section of the story where we're introduced to Sam. And in this part of the story, the narrator is the operator and Sam is the target. And if, as Bart would say, the eidos or essence of the photograph is death, then what Ozit gives us is an actual death. Or if you like, taking a shot becomes an actual shooting here. The translator at this conference on Chile is assassinated, shot. It seems by accident because they were shooting at someone else. But, you know, she shoots the shooting. And so we have this idea, the metaphor of gunsight. It connects to Cupid's arrow, this idea of being struck, which conflates the two themes of this story, photography and love. And that comes more into play later in the story. And we have this conversation between Sam and the narrator towards the bottom of this page. I reflected how quickly vertical becomes horizontal. She's got a nice kind of cynical eye, I think, this narrator. You knew him, I said. Only in a public way. He's been part of all these meetings. So have I said. I've watched you watching me. So this idea of I'm looking at you, looking at me. I resisted this. That's professional watching. It's more like stalking. I've always stalked a bit before I shoot. So she's got something of the voyeur about her too. Towards the bottom of this page 258, the murder had cut short the series of symposia. The South Americans scattered, which was too bad. They were Sam's source of vitality. And the two of them become, in a sense, an item. I never wanted to listen to Sam on the subjects he was expert in, and I never did. This is interesting because it goes back to that epiphany she's had 2 pages before. This idea that there is a truth and we can access it, but it's beyond language. So look what she says here. I never wanted to listen to Sam on the subjects he was expert in, and I never did. I only caught what I thought of as their moans, impure and simmering and winnowing and sad. The sounds that came through his microphone were always intensely public. His audience maintained a marvelous generalist. Blah, 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 blah. But I had a little trick in my head, as he declaimed, and as I popped my flashbulbs, not always at him, more often at the distinguished sponsors of the event, I could tell they were distinguished from the way they dragged me up to the dais to photograph them. So what's the trick? The little trick is this. Whatever he said that was vast and public and South American, I would simultaneously translate. I hoped I wouldn't be gunned down for it, into everything private and personal and secret. So this required me to listen shrewdly to the moan behind the words, behind the metaphors and the similes. I had to blot out the words for the sake of the tune. And sometimes the tune would be civil or sweet or almost jolly. But mainly, it would be narrow and drab and resigned. I knew he had a wife. Bah, there she is. But I was already 36 and he didn't have a wife by then. But it turns out that it's the wife that is the tune Sam is moaning about. Here at the bottom, wife, wife, wife. He didn't like her. He wasn't happy with her. His whole life was wrong. He was a dead man. If I thought I'd seen a dead man when they took that poor fellow out on the stretcher, I was stupidly mistaken. He was 10 times deader than that. If the terrorist who couldn't shoot straight had shot him instead, he couldn't be more riddled with gunshot than he was this minute. He was smoking with his own death. So, surprise, surprise, wife's name is Verity. Verity means truth. Turns out that Verity is not just, well, she is the personification of everything brilliant and wonderful. There she is. She cooks brilliantly. She makes things. She saws like a mad woman. She sews. What can't she do? She paints. She's wonderful. She's terrific. Here we are. She's a goddamn goddess. He says she's powerful and autonomous and a goddamn genius. Christ, he said, I hate my life. If I had someone like that at home, I'd say I'd never be out in the rain. Oh, she could abolish the weather if she wanted to. I mean, she doesn't want to. She has a terrific will. Okay. Now there's this wonderful encounter between Verity and the narrator at the bottom here of this page, 261. So she comes up to him and says, you're the one who shot the simultaneous translator. Ah, judicial evidence, I reply. Now let me, she said, ask you something about your trade. In photography, do you constantly get what you expect? I said, it's the same as life. Verity expressed itself. The viewfinder, the viewfinder. Well, I always look through that first, I admitted. And then, do you get what you see? I mean, can you predict exactly, or are you always surprised by what comes out? I can never predict, I told her, but I'm never surprised. Ooh, that's fatalism, Verity said. Her voice was an iron arrow. She put her forefinger into my cheek, as humbly as a bride. Talk about shots. Here's a parting one. You take a shot at Sam, no expectations. He's not like life. He's safe. He's good. There we are. Sam is the man of virtue, but Verity has just shot the narrator. She knew everything exactly. Even when everything was nothing, she knew it exactly. She was without any fear at all. Jealousy wasn't in her picture. She was more virtuous than he was. She was big. She had a great engine. She was her own Cargill. Well, we're seeing the jealousy of the narrator here, I think, aren't we? It's a bullet in the neck. It gets you from the outside. One moment you're in your prime of health, the next you're in anguish. Cupid's arrow, yeah, so the narrator is being shot here. She's been fixed or shot by Verity. into being the would-be mistress. I saw it in her glow, in her sureness, in her pride. He'd have to go home in the end. Another moment I think that's quite important in the story, halfway down the next page, repeating, if you like, the same epiphany she's had earlier. You're too miracle-minded even for a historian, I admonished him. It's not like that at all. If you have a change of heart between shooting your picture and taking it out of the developer, the picture changes too. I wanted to explain to him how, between the exposure and the solution, history comes into being. But telling that would make me bleed like a bullet in the neck, so I said instead, photography is literal. It gets what's there. It's the process itself which is the truth. Now we have the narrator photographing the target, Sam, under a linden tree. I guess the symbolism here is that the linden tree is a symbol of, is the tree of love in Germanic literature in particular. A nice moment here, about 10 lines down. He asks me why I want to shoot him under the linden tree. I tell him the truth I took from his wife. Virtue ravishes me. I want to keep its portrait. I'm silent about the orphaned moment we're living in now, how it will leave us. I feel our pathos. We are virtue's orphans. The tree's green shoots are fleeting. All green corrupts to brown. And so we have again this idea of mortality and death. So he consents to having his picture taken if I agree to go home with him afterward. I can't go home with you. She's there. Sure, she's always there. Then how can I go home with you? You have to see. It's all been too obscure. I want you to know what I know. You have to get the smell of it. So they go. And we have this very interesting ending. Verity decides that they're all going to dress up for photographs to be taken. This is the bottom of this next page. Let's dress you up, Verity says out of her teacup. She's already downed a quantity of cake. There's stuff in that box that would just fit you. You've got a waist like our girls. I wish I had a waist like that. I protest. I tell her it's too silly. And Sam smolders with his sour satisfaction. And they dress up, and there she is. She's got a long skirt, a blouse called a bodice, long sleeves. I look at myself. Period piece, says Verity. I'm all in brown. As brown as leaves. No surprise there, right? So Verity dresses up, and I shoot Verity, wearing the nun's bonnet. Look at you, she cries. I return to the mirror to see. I'm grave. I have no smile. My face is mysteriously shut. I'm suffering. Love sick and dream sick. I'm dreaming of my desire. I'm already 36 years old. Tomorrow I'll be 48 years old. And a crafty parallelogram begins to frame the space between my nose and mouth. My features are very distinct. I will live for years and years before they slide out of the mirror. I'm the brown girl in the pocket of my blouse. I reek of history. And so it is. She's slipped now from being operated to target. And that conflates with her being spectator in her mind of her targeted image. If this minute I could glide into chemical solution, as if in a gondola, splashed all over and streaming with wet silver, with the mirror seize and fix me like a photographic plate. I watch Sam's eyes, poached and pale and mottled with furious old civilizations, steaming hatred for his wife. I trip over the long drapery of my nun's hem. All the same, I catch up my camera without dropping it, my ambassador of desire, my secret house with its single shutter, my chaste aperture, my dead infant, husband of my bosom. Their two heads, hers light, his black, negatives of each other, are caught side by side in their daughter's mirror. I shoot into their heads, the white harp behind. Now they are exposed. Now they will stick forever. Verity is the negative for Sam's positive, if you like. And they need each other. And I think the narrator sees that. And that's why Sam cannot leave Verity. And that's why all the photographer can do here is shoot that, is take that. That's the composite truth that she can at least fix and take away. And I think that what Ozick is suggesting here is that the truth of photography, if we can call it that, is its act of something becoming, and then something which became conflated and fixed, caught in the moment. And everything else is just kitsch. Everything else is just metaphoric guff. You don't need language, because that's it. The truth of the photograph exists in the ineffable beyond language. And if we are to have any sense of this at all, it's going to be that notion of mortality, of time. All green corrupts to brown, right? And I think, I just want to say this because I think the brownness is significant here. Whether it be sepia or not, I think the suggestion is the reason why the original unnamed photographer continually overexposed and created a kind of sepia brown tint is because brown resides, if you like, in between the light and the dark. It's between the white and the black. It's that position in between. Brown represents the truthful merging of light and dark, of life and death. That's, I think, how I would put it. So, fairly complicated story, I think. And God knows you could read it differently from the way I have. In fact, that's really what I must say at the end of this process, which is all I can do here in front of this little green light is give you my interpretation of these stories as best I can. And it is for you now to add to or subtract from that interpretation as you wish. In any case, at least now you've got something to work with, I hope, in terms of how you can discuss these stories and how they treat the photographic process. Next, we move to Everything is Illuminated. And so much of what we've been talking about, particularly in respect of Roland Barthes, will come into play in our analysis of that novel. Okay, so thank you for your time, and we'll meet up again in the next video. Bye for now.